What's up, everybody? Welcome back. I hope you're doing well. Um, Before we get started today, I thought we would just kind of begin slowly. I know that you've been working very hard and submitting assignments and doing a lot of work for the class. Thank you very much to those of you who submitted your research design papers. I'm looking forward to reading those, and I've heard from many of you already about what you're working on, and it's all very exciting. Um, you may have noticed that I posted the grades for the midterms. The mean was an 85, and I thought that overall they were very good. I'm still working on getting some feedback back to you. I discovered that COVID-19 presents us with a lot of challenges, and it just takes a ton of time to just create all these new documents and do a lot of the work involved in providing the feedback in the same manner of time. And so I'm going to return that feedback to you, but it hasn't happened yet. And so I apologize about that. But you do have your midterm grades, and I'm very satisfied with those grades. I think that you did a great job. I can see the hard work that you put into it. And I really appreciate in particular how creative you were in your responses on the essay. I learned a great deal from you. And so thank you for that. So good job. I will have some more feedback for you though as we go forward, and hopefully that will be relatively soon. I just wasn't ready to send out feedback yet because I don't have it for everyone yet, but the grades are posted. Now, with regard to the research design papers, as a reminder, this was an assignment that was designed to get you prepared for the final paper, which will be sort of a continuation of the research design. So the good news is that if you have that assignment done, you're well on the way to writing the final paper, which should fall into place relatively smoothly if you've taken those steps involved in arranging your research design and writing out the outline. And so, as always, there's a method to this madness, and I hope that you trust in the process and that you see the value of doing this assignment. I think that it's always useful for us to think about the moving parts before we do any kind of analysis. And moreover, it's been, I think, good for you and for me as well to kind of interact and correspond with you while you work on your research design papers. Many of you, as I said, have already contacted me, and I'm happy to give you input. Now, that being said, we will have a lecture and a discussion today, like usual. We'll return to form and introduce a new set of topics for the class. But the good news is, as always, that it's going to build really nicely on what we've done so far. So our topic for today is parties and party systems. And we'll talk about parties and party systems in particular in relation to democracy, because that's what we're focused on now in Latin America. Now, before we get started, though, I wanted to kind of double back and have a discussion with you about how to strengthen democracy in Latin America. And this is a conversation that has us thinking about a whole set of issues that relate to the quality of democracy and democratic transitions and all of these concepts that we introduced on Monday and that we've seen over and over throughout the course. So I want to take us back then to where we kind of stopped on Monday, and that was sort of sizing up the progress that's been made in Latin America with regard to promoting democracy and moving democratization forward. Remember that we talked about the first period of the third wave between about 1972 and 1992 as being a period of great democratic progress. A whole number of transitions to democracy occurred. And in particular, we saw country after country throw off the shackles of really repressive military rule, and that was very inspiring. We know, though, that the period between 1992 and the early 2000s saw stagnation in the sort of advance of democracy, in the sense that many countries didn't make progress. And in particular, in a lot of countries, semi-authoritarian presidents kind of filled the void left by relatively weak political parties, weak democratic institutions, et cetera. But the situation really kind of deteriorated further beginning in the late 2000s, and really, I think, beginning in about 2011, when in the course of about 10 years, four prominent Latin American democracies slid back into authoritarian rule. And those included Venezuela, Bolivia, until recently, the new election, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. Several other countries became what we would refer to as semi authoritarian. And in general, the picture doesn't look very inspiring as far as the future of democracy is concerned. And so the conclusion that we kind of reached is that Latin American democracies are subject to backsliding, in that these new democracies um, don't always follow a linear path of development. There are a lot of false starts and kind of fits. And in general, the picture is much more complicated than maybe we would like to think. And the question then arises, how do we avoid this backsliding? How do we strengthen these democracies so that they can outlast these growing pains, and so that they can get over these humps, so that they can cross these paths, these forks in the road, and remain democratic and not reverse back to authoritarian rule? And so this is the question I want to put to you, just kind of gathering up everything that we've learned from the class, everything that we know about Latin America, about the societies, the political systems. How can Latin American democracies be strengthened? What could be done to reinforce democratization processes and make backsliding less likely? I'd like to hear from as many of you as possible, and I want this to be a robust discussion because it's a very open-ended question. And so please indulge me over the mic, preferably, but also the chat, of course, too, if you'd like to participate in that way.
I think that one social change that could be made was reminding people of the consequences of authoritarianism in Latin American countries. As we talked about with military rule in countries such as Chile under Pinochet, thousands were disappearing and getting killed by the military in a sort of plot to stop communist spread in the country. And institutional change would probably be something along the lines of moving less power from the executive and putting it in the hands of the legislature. So maybe like removing like a veto power and an item line veto for the president.
Okay, great. There's a lot of stuff there. First, Ishan mentioned maybe preserving the memory of those lost during military rule to repressive practices of the regimes. That's done in places like Chile and Argentina with museums that are set up with public money to commemorate those memories and to keep intact the understanding of what took place at that time. I was myself able to visit the Museum of Memory and Human Rights in Chile, and I saw firsthand the effort that they make to preserve that memory. So I think that that's a good point. Ishan's point about maybe redistributing power from the executive to the legislature is also really, really interesting, because as you've seen so far, these executives are really powerful. And in fact, they're more powerful often than anywhere else in the world as far as presidential democracies are concerned. And so this is one source of maybe some of the instability. Lo and behold, a lot of these countries that revert back to authoritarian rule do so under the guise of a ruling presidency. You're not necessarily a military regime. There may be a reason for that. It's because the presidents are very powerful in the context of those systems, the powers that they're given by the constitutions. So those are all really good points, but there's so much more here to the discussion, and I want to open it up further. And so let's continue to talk about what can be done to strengthen Latin American democracies.
I think that one of the key things that we've seen, or that I've personally seen, um, maintaining the integrity of like the democracy within a country has been really something that has not been there substantially enough um, on behalf of Latin American countries, just because I have noticed that like there's a lot of corruption, like like a lot of the drug leaders I've noticed that like help like put people in place in governance so that that way they like turn a blind eye, and like that's something like that has led like to the democracy not being so trustworthy, at least within Latin American countries, from what I've like seen.
Yeah, this is a serious issue. Like, did you know? And you probably do know. But for example, it's been estimated that at certain times, as much as a third of the money circulating in the Mexican economy is literally, attributable to the drug trade. And so that's really, really consequential for politics and for the economy and for society. And what Juan is pointing out is true. These criminal gangs are so powerful and well connected that they're able to basically infiltrate institutions in many cases, banks, democratic institutions, political parties, and they're able to place their own, or they're able to exert control over politicians. And in doing so, they gain leverage and they gain influence in these systems. And they're able to, of course, contribute to corruption, and they're able to control decision making, and they're able to get outcomes that are favorable to them and that might take the heat off of their activities. In some places, like in Mexico, until 2000, they had a system of basically state-sanctioned protection for drug gangs. And the deal was, if drug gangs didn't fight each other and if they provided the state with a cut of their revenues, they would be allowed to operate free of scrutiny. Now, those deals don't really exist anymore, but the legacies of those deals are alive and well. And those legacies include this infiltration that I talked about, and et cetera, and et cetera. So to Juan's point, how do you address that? Well, you have to address it by creating institutions and bodies of government that are in charge of combating corruption. So you've got to create independent anti-corruption bodies. You've got to create institutions of accountability and transparency that are in charge of auditing and kind of overseeing a lot of these decisions in these processes. But is that a magic bullet? Certainly not. And can those bodies themselves be corrupted? Without a doubt. The point is that I think that institutions are often a solution to these challenges, because we can create new domains and new centers of power that have responsibilities and functions that can help to work against some of those patterns. But how you really do that differs from country to country, and the context is always unique. And the diversity of Latin America is what makes these challenges so prickly and so sticky. And so the Mexican case will be different than the Guatemalan case, and that will be different from the Panamanian case, and so on and so forth. But Juan's point is a good one, because as we'll see later in the class, the influence of drug gangs and the role of criminal organizations in particular, really, really consequential. And it's not well understood yet because it's relatively new, or at a minimum, it's been hard to study for a long time. And so though we don't know much about it, we desperately need to better understand it. And I think the democracies themselves would benefit greatly from reducing that corruption and getting those bad actors out of politics, if you can, right? And whether you can is really the challenge, but there might be a way out. Thank you, Juan. It's a very
There's
good.
a lot in the chat.
I see that. Do you have a comment that you want to make, Quinn?
My comment was pretty similar to Juan's, actually.
Okay. Okay, so let me go ahead and address some of these comments in the chat. Quinn says reducing the power and influence of drug cartels would probably be a good step forward because they contribute to a lot of corruption and political violence. I certainly understand Quinn's interjection in that case, because you made the same point, and you made that point, I think, a few minutes ago. Christian says, I think ultimately it's two things. One is establishing new key actors that engage with the people on a more personal level, politicians and activists who have worked with the people on a grassroots level. The other is to increase education and access across the country so people understand their government to the fullest. Christian, that's a good point. One thing I think we have to be wary of, though, is the possibility that closer connections between politicians and voters could lead to a resurgence of populism. We know that populism has been a corrosive influence in the past because it's tended to discredit democratic institutions. But on the other hand, your point is a really good one, because we know that in a country like Chile, the political parties have become very ossified and inflexible, and they're often criticized for not being responsive to citizens. And so it would be useful for those parties to connect with voters and real people on a more grassroots level, and maybe kind of re-enliven some of those original connections between voters and parties that formed through the transition to democracy in 1990. In increasing education and access across the country so people understand their government to the fullest. Totally. So in a country like Bolivia or Ecuador, how much will politics change if we more fully incorporate indigenous people into the political process? What about enfranchising more people and raising education levels and expanding the middle class? You know, those are all really powerful determinants of democratization. And we could imagine that democracy would be strengthened further by, say, expanding the middle class in a country like Peru, or enfranchising more Indians in a country like Ecuador or Bolivia, and so on. Abel says, I believe the way we could possibly strengthen is through defunding or demolishing military powers, as well as to keep special interests from corporations and politicians away out of politics. Yeah, so you have to reduce the power of the military. And that's because a lot of times these politicians fall back on the military during moments of crisis. They'll give them emergency powers, they'll give them more influence or more formal responsibility, often as part of an effort to shore up their own candidacy or their own administration. Embattled democratic presidents empowering the military is a ticket to democratic erosion, because those militaries have a tendency to take and take and take. And so those organized interests like the military and other actors who might not have the best interest of the people or democracy in mind can undermine democracy. So disempowering them might be an important step. Jose says, I would personally say that removing corruption for what it stands for, Latin America is notorious for having corruption widespread at so many levels throughout. So in a way, a reform is needed on a case-by-case basis to hold the leaders of these countries accountable for their actions. Again, corruption is so important. And you know, even in my own research, though I study political economy and economic policy reform, much of my own research has been motivated by a desire to figure out how to reform institutions that contribute to corruption. And those institutions include like export taxes that provide the military with off-budget export revenue, defense industries that are controlled and managed by militaries and that aren't subject to civilian control. These are all sources of corruption. And there are other sources too, like relationships between private businesses and politicians, especially in a country like Argentina. Corruption is so notoriously Latin American, it's almost cultural. And I don't mean that as a slight. It really is a region that is unfortunately awash with corruption. And some countries are better than others. Chile and Uruguay, for example, are relatively free of corruption, but countries like Argentina and Brazil are very corrupt. And in some ways, that hasn't changed much since the transition to democracy. So Jose's point is a very good one. Alondra says, have more direct understanding of what it means to be a democracy. I think many countries have their own interpretations, just influences what they do and what certain areas are the way they are. Keeping that accountability of ruling that democracy is important. So forms of accountability, and then also understanding democracy. So in Alondra's point, I'm hearing more of an emphasis on education and on how education can create constituencies and voters who are better able to hold elected actors and politicians accountable. That's certainly important. And we know that that gets to the substantive definition of democracy that focuses on the quality of democracy and the outcomes produced by the regime. Maricela says, we can try to close or shorten the gap between the new demands, expectations, and behaviors that accompany the rapid extension of the population in the Latin American countries and the political system or government in power. In Mexico, it was known that ex-president Peña Nieto took bribes from cartels so that they can operate without a problem. So 2 points there from Maricela. So in the first case, rapid development has produced a lot of new groups in Latin American countries that have a variety of new demands and that place pressures on governments closing the gap between those and maybe the political system and the government in power, I interpret that as saying bring voters and governments closer in terms of the demands of the former and the responses of the latter. And that's certainly important. We know that one of the reasons that the party systems collapsed in Peru and Venezuela is because parties that had been relatively solidified for almost half a century stopped responding to voters and were incapable increasingly of responding meaningfully to changes in society that demanded that they reform the system accordingly. And then, of course, in Mexico, the example of Peña Nieto and the bribes that he allegedly took from cartels, I remember hearing about that too. That is certainly a problem, and that gets to that nature of corruption that we talked about. Quinn says, unfortunately, we as Americans fell victim to the dangers of populism, and now we've got Trump. Perfect example right there. So Quinn is pointing out that, look, the United States, not that different from Latin American countries in that regard. And you know what? When I went to Latin America, and when I was in Argentina and Chile, Trump had just been elected a year earlier. And people said to me over and over, seeing Trump get elected makes me realize that the United States is not that different from Latin American countries after all, because he's a populist and a demagogue, and he is a threat to democracy. This is what they said to me, but they were comparing him to many of the leaders that they themselves had had over the years, the Carlos Minims, the Alberto Fujimoris, the Hugo Chavez's, the Evo Moraleses to a certain extent. Say what you will about some of their economic policies and their contributions to development, but they in many cases were harmful to democracy. Delianor says, there's a flip side to this. Drug lords support many by providing jobs plus paying off politicians so their dollars help keep the economy going. This is certainly true, Delianor, and in a purely objective sense, it is money generated and plugged into the economy. But what I would encourage us to think about is the productivity of that investment and how that revenue and that money that's essentially diverted to criminal activity could be invested more productively and can be harnessed and used to contribute to social and economic development, education levels, and access to healthcare. You know, a peso spent is not always spent equally. And I think sometimes the issue of corruption and the issue of criminal activity is that it's often a drag on economies because of its tendency to waste such massive amounts of resources. And so I think that's one of the issues, accepting that obviously, you know, it's money spent and money circulated. And Quinn adds also the important moral dimension, which is that doesn't justify profiting off of murder and corruption. But Quinn also acknowledges that Delianor has a point, and I acknowledge that too. The point is that we can make arguments on both sides, and if we can see this in a nuanced way, we're going to be better for it. Jose says, but she does have a point. Sometimes there are no means for people to make a decent living off of the jobs available, so they are pushed towards this easy way out. But what I would stress to you all is that that's a failure of government. That's a failure of policy. If the state cannot exert control over and reduce criminal violence related to drug cartels and the production of drugs at a huge scale, it's not able to, in the same way, invest in health and education and make productive investments that could pay off for those people who have to otherwise turn to the drug cartels. And so what I want us to think about is the way in which the failures of governments and states create opportunities for that kind of activity, as well as create the need for that activity from the perspective of those who depend on those kinds of work. But let's think about what the government and the state can do to reduce that violence in that activity and make more productive investments of those resources. And Delianor adds, I'm not justifying what drug lords do, but this is a true reality for many. It certainly is. It is. Juan adds, look, I'm not saying that because I have lost loved ones to drug leaders in Mexico, but I will say that they have provided for some a way of life and the means of an honest job at times. And so this is personal for some of us, and I admire us so much for sharing this information and having this discussion, because this gets us to really where the rubber meets the road. We're talking about the lives of real people. And so this is not just an academic exercise. This is something that has political implications. And so that's why we're talking about this. Quinn adds, yes, and that is the harsh reality. I hope that one day that will not be their reality, that people won't have to turn to drugs profiting from them. Alejandra says, also, sadly, the military is also involved with the cartels, so the people of Mexico have nowhere to turn for protection. Often civilians form their own small militias to guard towns and keep cartels out. This works sometimes, but a majority of the time, the cartels are too well equipped and are able to take them down and take over. Yes, and in my understanding, Alejandra, is that in these cases, communities, in particular in Mexico, they form these self-defense forces precisely because the police and the military have been bought off and have been infiltrated by the cartels and cannot be counted on to protect and defend the community. In other cases, the state doesn't have the capacity to extend control throughout the region, and these communities are left to fend for themselves. But in either case, what this underscores is a failure of the state, a failure of the government, a failure of policy, right? The weakness of the state relative to these criminal organizations who are capable of purchasing them and buying them off and infiltrating them, and then leaving whole communities to fend for themselves. And so this is, from my view, this is a failure of government. This is a failure of policy, a failure of the state. Christian says, it's a depressingly humbling moment when you can see yourself in the US. I'm not sure what you mean, Christian. Can you explain that? I think I know what you mean, but I want you to clarify. Delianor says, they were right. Trump is a blot on America's outstanding presidents. I always kind of thought so too. Quinn says, Juan, I meant to say it, but I am sorry for your loss. I hope those people can hope one day be brought to justice to bring you closure. Juan, I agree with Quinn. I'm so terribly sorry, but I thank you for sharing your story with us and relating it to what we're talking about, because it gives us an opportunity to learn and experience this in a very small way, in a way that we couldn't just reading about it or discussing it without your input. And so thank you, but we're so sorry. Maricela says, piggybacking to what Alejandra said, the military has been very involved in the disappearance of the 43 students that were standing up to the government and demanded change. The parents or family members of these students had no one to turn to for help. Yeah, so this is the disappearance of 43 students in Mexico several years ago now. It was discovered later that they were basically buried in a mass grave, and the military had been involved in their disappearance, along with, I think, some police and security forces. But I don't know a lot about the situation beyond that. I think that there was a link to drug cartels as well. But above all, I think what this again highlights is a failure of the state, in the sort of weakness of the state and the incapacity of the state to exert control and establish a monopoly of violence in the way that we define a state as doing effectively. Christian says, what I meant was it puts America on less of a pedestal in the grand scheme of the word. I'm used to it, people raising it high above other countries when we really aren't all that different. Yeah, Christian, and what it taught me too is that Latin Americans and Argentines and Chileans can see their experience in ours, just in the same way that I can see ours and theirs to a certain degree. And I think, interestingly enough, that was the moment where Latin Americans and Americans began to think of themselves as more alike than ever before. Of course, there are a variety of opinions about Trump, and I acknowledge that there are valid arguments and perspectives and opinions. But at least among those of us who may be less supportive of the man, I think that one of the sort of positive outcomes has been that we're able to empathize with Latin Americans more than ever before, and maybe them with us. And so it's an interesting moment. And from this perspective, we're probably learning, I think, from Latin America, and hopefully we'll continue to do so. Okay, so I made a list of my own. And as I thought about this, I think what you'll notice is that I came up with virtually everything that you came up with. The first thing that I had is reduce the influence and power of the military. You know, why is it that militaries have constitutional rights and responsibilities that mean that they're the first one in line to get emergency powers during a crisis? Obviously, the military is an important actor, but presidents shouldn't be in a position to just, give them a blank check at the first sign of distress. And so when an embattled democratically elected president turns to the military in Latin America, they do so increasingly to try to legitimate themselves and suppress or repress the population, and that can't be. So there's got to be some effort to reduce the power of the military in its domestic security operations, countries like Chile and Bolivia show us that that's essentially it's an essential component of any sort of democratic reform. Second, we have to increase the power of the legislature. I showed you already, or I'll show you in a while, in maybe a week or two, that Latin American presidents have really robust legislative powers. In fact, in a lot of countries, the legislators themselves cannot introduce bills. But what does that mean? That means that the legislators have fewer levers that they can use to exert control over the executive. And it means that they're in a weaker position often than the executive is relative to them. If we could even out those powers a little bit by strengthening the legislature, that would go a long way to creating more stability and kind of sort of weakening these powerful executives that often end up abusing their powers and turning into ruling presidents. And so that ties into number 3, which is supposed to be number 3. Sorry, there's 2 number 2s there. We have to decrease the powers of the executive. Why is it that in Chile only the president can introduce legislation? That doesn't make any sense. Shouldn't it be the case that legislators should be able to introduce bills too? Shouldn't it be the case that presidents should be more restricted in their ability to transfer funds from one agency to another? Shouldn't it be the case that the legislature can initiate one of its own sessions, and that it doesn't have to be initiated by the executive? These are powers that are important and that relate to the balance of power between the legislature and the executive. On a similar level, I think that we should bolster judicial independence. A lot of the courts, the Supreme Courts in Latin American countries, are just overrun and just chock full of party stalwarts and loyalists. In particular, in a country like Venezuela, the Supreme Court has been packed and taken over and has even been given powers over the legislature. And so it's not an independent institution. It's not a body that can serve as a viable or an effective check on either the executive or the legislature for that matter. And so it needs to be independent in its configuration and its relationship to those other institutions. And then fourth, we have strengthening accountability institutions like electoral management bodies, which count votes and ensure the sort of clean outcome in an election. They ensure the integrity of the election. Accountability institutions are also involved in overseeing or sort of auditing the campaign activities of politicians or parties, different democratic institutions and what they're up to. Those could include corruption bodies and anti-corruption bodies as well. And this relates to number 5, electoral reform. In a lot of countries, they have what we call closed list proportional representation. And this is where you vote for a party, but once you vote for that party, the party leaders of the parties who get votes are the ones who pick the representatives who will represent that party in the legislature. That's closed list. Open list is where you vote for candidates, and those candidates go into the legislature based upon the proportion that their party wins. The reason that a change from a closed list to an open list is important is because closed lists tend to contribute to corruption. The reason is because when you conceal who the potential legislators are, that gives the party leader substantial power, and they can then basically bribe or extort or kind of force legislators or potential legislators to steal from the bureaucracy or to steal from other parts of the state or other institutions in order to finance party activities. With an open list, party leaders don't have that control over party stalwarts and potential legislators, and therefore they cannot extort them or sort of force them into stealing for the team, so to speak, in the same way. So that relates to corruption.
Sorry.
Yes, Quinn.
Are you also saying, in a way, that they could basically sell the seat as well?
Yeah, that's what they typically do. Well, so that's one thing that they can do. That's one way of looking at it. So the way this typically works is, I should give you the context. In Latin America, a lot of politicians who wind up in Congress begin in the bureaucracy, and they work as civil servants or as bureaucrats. And the reason that's important is because if it's a closed list PR system and those party stalwarts who want to be legislators are in the bureaucracy, the party leader can basically force them or kind of ask them to steal as much as possible from the bureaucracy for the party. And those bureaucrats who steal the most for the party are the ones who are able to essentially kind of purchase the seat that will be handed to them by the party leader should the party win a sizable share of the vote in the election. And so it's that connection between the bureaucracy and the legislature that often lends itself to corruption under a closed list. They are in effect selling their, well, they are in effect purchasing their seat. I guess you could think of the party leader as selling the seat in the sense that they're asking for the highest price that they can get, and they're trying to extract as much from the state as they can through those bureaucrats who want to be legislators. So this happened extensively under Menem in Argentina. It's happened extensively throughout the democratic period in Bolivia. It's also happened a lot in Venezuela too. It's called stealing from the team. Number 6, strengthen political parties. What does that mean in practice? That means that they must have more resources. First of all, bigger budgets. They must have closer links with parties. They must have more local branches, more extensive networks of offices and headquarters. They must, in a sense, be further institutionalized, and they must be committed to ideologies that stand the test of time, and they must not be sort of victim to personalities who are able to rule the party and kind of take control of the party. They must be parties that are valued as parties, not as parties that are valued for personalities. And so this has often been a challenge in Latin America because there's been such a tradition of populism. We know that leaders like Menem and Fujimori and Chavez, Morales, Maduro even, these are populist leaders who don't necessarily depend substantially on parties. This is a common pattern. But in order to combat that, you need to strengthen parties over personalities. Then number 7, expand women's rights and representation. This is critically important because it's been shown that the more women who are in legislatures, the more effective policymaking can be, and the more responsive it can be. It's also been shown that expanding women's rights, in particular reproductive rights, significantly improves like health indicators. It gives people the capacity to exert political and social rights more forcefully. It draws them into politics, and it's the right thing to do. And so these are things that matter too. Relatedly, number 8, strengthen social movements and minority groups. I'm talking about indigenous movements and indigenous groups. I'm talking about nationwide indigenous movements in a country like Peru, where indigenous groups are weakly coordinated and they don't have a lot of relationship to each other. In countries like Ecuador, by contrast, there's this large sort of indigenous nationwide movement, social movement, where they're well connected. These social movements can strengthen democracy by giving a lot of support to strong parties that often reside on the left that are focused on expanding representation, improving representation, deepening democratic reforms, and weakening the military and carrying out other types of institutional reforms that can really help to strengthen democracy. Minority groups in general, expanding their rights and their representation and their movements is usually quite important. That includes student movements, but also Blacks in Brazil, to peasants in Ecuador, wherever it might be, whichever group we're talking about. Enfranchising them further is usually an effective way to improve democracy because it creates a system where there are more actors, more participants, and there's the possibility of more responsiveness. And then finally, but not least, reducing economic inequality. Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. It's an absolute bastion of extreme inequality. Even the best examples of democracy in Latin America, like Chile, are still very, very unequal. And so reducing the gaps between the very, very richest and the poorest, that's crucial because those poor people who are made poorer by the escalating income inequality are not able to participate in politics. they're not able to exert political and social rights. They're not able to hold politicians and parties accountable. And as a result, those institutions become further ossified and further unresponsive to large swaths of society. They become detached and they become elitist, and they tend to reproduce policy. And in general, it doesn't really help to move the needle, so to speak, in terms of deepening democracy. I'm going to read a couple comments before we continue. Jet says, I would argue about the critical role that USA's war on drugs had on the corruption of governments in Latin America. In that light, I would argue for decriminalization of drugs and allow that corrupt money to be tracked and folded into tax revenues. Okay, so for example, Plan Colombia in Colombia was a program that channeled billions of dollars into combating the drug production and cartel activity in Colombia, but it's been shown that much of that money was either squandered or sort of diverted or became a source of waste, or at a very minimum contributed to corruption in some way. And so I think Jet's point is a good one. The US war on drugs has set the tone for a lot of the policy responses in Latin America with regard to this issue. And to give you a sense of, the different sort of faces of this issue, I'm actually forgetting who this was, but there's a former president, or even still a current president of a Latin American country, who was a coca farmer and who understood well and understands well the nature of that economic activity and how it was a part of and is a part of Latin America, but how it's been viewed so differently by the United States, who viewed it really negatively and detrimentally, and maybe differently than, say, it was viewed by this president and Latin Americans, who in some ways view it as a part of the fabric of Latin America. So producing coca, that's something that goes back much further than commercial and high scale drug activity. That's something that is ancient. And so there's a lot of history and a lot of sort of ancient civilization here that goes way back that we can't really address, or that I can't address correctly or appropriately, because I just don't know enough about it. But my point is to say that the US war on drugs has been driven by its own interpretation of the problem. And Latin America has interpreted this very differently often, and that's often been shown in the disjuncture between the two sides. Quinn says, I was also thinking about what I learned in my class in comparative political parties, and if I remember right, I think we learned that having closed list PR takes away the incentive of politicians to cultivate a personal vote. So my thought is it possible to reinstate closed list PR when their democracy is more consolidated? Correct me if I'm wrong. Let me read this again. If I remember right, I think we learned that having closed list PR takes away the incentive of politicians to cultivate a personal vote. Yes, I would agree, right? Because you have to basically appeal to the party leader, who will appoint you if they like you enough and the party gets enough votes. You don't necessarily have to appeal to the voters because they're not voting for you directly. So there is no incentive to cultivate a personal vote. But at the same time, it's also, of course, liable to contribute to corruption if the need to satisfy the party leader means that you're forced to steal from the bureaucracy and finance party activities in order to get picked for a seat in your legislative race later. So those are both reasons against a closed list. So I guess my question for you, Quinn, is should we ever have closed lists? And you're asking, can we reinstate closed list PR when their democracy is more consolidated? We certainly maybe could. I think we'd have to identify the merits of a closed list system, because I don't know if those are super clear, at least in the context of Latin America, if it takes away the incentive to cultivate a personal vote and if it contributes to corruption. Those are two pretty difficult hurdles to get over. Because I think Quinn says, I think more consolidated democracies successfully have closed list PR. So that I can't speak to. I don't know as much about proportional representation rules in consolidated democracies. I know the Latin American case is better. I would wonder why those more consolidated systems, if they do, why they would have closed list systems or what the advantage would be. Honest question. I don't know the answer to it, but it's an interesting question that we'll deal with, I'm sure, in some way going forward. As we continue, I just want to show you an image of some of the sort of, public discourse around women's rights and reproductive rights, and how social and health issues are related to infant mortality in Latin American countries. And in Latin American countries, abortion is, I think, universally illegal. I don't know if there's a single Latin American country, I could be mistaken, but I don't know if there's a single one where abortion is legal. And as a result, there are high levels or higher levels of infant mortality. Women's reproductive rights in general are much, much weaker, if not non-existent in some places, compared to at least what we understand as the norm here. And what we see here is an image that seems to capture this in the kind of anguish, but also the opinions and the kind of debate around this issue. And I think that the issue of women's reproductive rights is so essential because it's not just reproductive rights, it's also the capacity to enter the economy more fully, become more integrated into society, and ultimately to exert other political and social rights that also impact on democracy. And so the issue of women's rights is really critical, and it's kind of a next frontier for Latin America, because while some countries like Uruguay have made a lot of advances in promoting women's rights, others like Guatemala or Nicaragua have not. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of variation from country to country. So this connects us really nicely to the next issue in the class, and this is parties and party systems. And I want to tell you first, before we get started, that we were originally going to deal with parties, party systems, and elections, but I realized that that was going to be a bit much to bite off, a bit too much to chew on in the limited time that we have. And so we're going to focus on parties and party systems. And we'll do so by talking about the different dimensions of party systems. We'll get a sense of the lay of the land in Latin America and what party systems look like and how they differ or how they're similar. We'll take a look at some examples and some case studies. And in general, we'll try to wrap our heads around this next topic in a way that is engaging and that connects us to democracy and makes us think about those issues of democratic consolidation, strengthening, and so on and so forth. So as we get started, we need to define party system. What is a party system? Well, a party system is the set of political parties in a political system that interact in patterned ways. Now, this very sort of innocuous definition actually contains a number of key components. So it implies, first and foremost, that the system must have at least two parties. Any system that only has one party is not a system, because there's no interaction, there's no sort of dynamic that unfolds. So in the first place, a system must have two parties. But the truth is, as you'll see, in Latin America, most systems have many more than just two parties. And so the party systems contain many, many interactions and many different patterns, often patterns and interactions that are far more complex than anything we're familiar with here in the United States. Now, secondly, these patterns suggest that there are some regularities in the distribution of support by parties over time, even if the relevant parties change over time. That is to say, there's got to be some continuity in this distribution of support. There can't be sharp changes in that distribution of support, or at least not so many of them that the system is changing substantially from year to year or from election to election. And then finally, this definition implies that there is continuity in the parties that form the system. And so though those parties that rise up and fall may change, and while some parties may gain influence or lose it, there is going to be relative continuity in who those main parties actually are. And so it could be that one election, the right-wing party wins the majority, the next election, the left-wing party wins the majority. But in those respective elections, the right and the left wings trade off occupying the majority. They don't fall off altogether. The right wing party is not replaced by a sort of anarchist party, so to speak. The point is that the same parties are part of the system, even if they lose vote share or gain vote share from election to election. Now, to say that they're part of the system, though, does mean that they have at least some share of the vote, right? If they don't have any of the vote, they cease to be a part of the system in the sense that they're no longer among those parties in a system that interact in a patterned way. They've fallen off the map altogether. So this is our definition of a party system. And this definition draws our attention to the possibility that there might be many parties, in that those many parties might stand in stark contrast to that one government that's in power. And this made me think of the Brazilian political system in the crisis of 2014 to 2016 in the relationship to the party system. Now, this crisis culminated in the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, former president of Brazil from the Workers' Party. She was impeached for irregularities, allegedly covering up some irregularities. She was originally investigated for corruption allegations, but the end result was her being impeached for irregularities in reporting and apparently alleged efforts to conceal the corruption itself. But the nature of the crisis itself that culminated in that impeachment was what really highlighted the role of the party system. In particular, at that time in Brazil, there were many, many parties, and the parties in the Congress exhibited a great deal of fragmentation. And this large set of parties stood in stark contrast to that Workers' Party government that, for all intents and purposes, was a leftist government. And so that crisis was in some ways a crisis of fragmentation and a crisis of the party system because of the differences that existed between the various parties. In the end, it was really the right wing that spearheaded that effort to bring down that leftist government. But that right wing was able to do that with the support of parties that were scattered in between. In the end, it was really a story about corruption, but also fragmentation, party system fragmentation, and really the impeachment of a president from a different party as the one that led the effort in the Congress. But in Latin America, it's also a story about old and new party systems. And the reason is because party systems require a great deal of continuity to be party systems, but we know already that party systems have frequently collapsed in places like Venezuela or Peru. They have changed considerably over time in places like Costa Rica, where they've expanded, or in places like Argentina, where the number of parties and the relevant parties have changed considerably over time too. These old and new party systems sometimes resemble each other and sometimes they don't. But in general, it's a story of change, often over continuity. And so the story of party systems in Latin America has often been an anguished story, a difficult story, an agonizing story, one that is rife with nuance in dynamism, but also dysfunction and fragmentation and change and disorder. With some exceptions, most Latin American party systems have changed a great deal. And this brings us to the ways that we can examine party systems and the dimensions of party systems that allow us to see the ways that they change. And so we're going to focus on three dimensions. And these are the three dimensions that we typically use in comparative politics to examine any party system, be it in Latin America or Eastern Europe or Asia or Africa or wherever. And those dimensions are as follows. First, the effective number of parties, or the relevant number of parties. That is, the number of parties who actually have a shot at winning. For example, in the US, we often say, oh, we have lots of political parties. But in reality, the Green Party doesn't have a shot at winning. The Republicans and the Democrats do, because they're the two major parties. For all intents and purposes, we have a two-party system. Even though the Green Party, the Socialist Party, and others do exist, they just don't have a shot at winning. Likewise, in Latin American countries, even though there may be dozens and dozens of parties nationwide, it may only be that 5 or 10 of them, or even 2 or 3 of them, actually have a shot at winning and actually win seats in the Congress or win the presidency. The second dimension is ideological polarization, and this relates to the distance that spans the rightmost and the leftmost parties. It's basically a measure of the space between the parties that occupy the outer edges of the system. And what we'll see is that over time, ideological polarization can change. It can widen, but it can also contract as well. And the direction that it goes will often reflect other factors as well. And the solidification of the party system can often mean kind of the solidification of parties around those two poles, the right and the left, or it can mean solidification around maybe a center-right party and a center-left party. Finally, we have party system institutionalization, and this relates to basically the extent to which the same parties compete over and over. Are the parties in the party system changing? To what degree do we have familiar faces? Are there new parties that rise to the fore and kind of take over from election to election or decade to decade? Or is there a great deal of continuity in those parties that occupy the system and that are effective parties? This relates to party system institutionalization, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about each of these in turn. Marcella says, if the parties know that they are not going to win, then why even remain in the system? Quinn says, so they can influence the major parties. And I think that Quinn's right. Even if they can't win seats, they can help to exert pressure on those parties that do win seats, and they can help to shape the agenda or move those parties to the left or the right. Because even if they can't overtake those parties that dominate the system, they can threaten to take seats from them unless those parties adapt and respond and become more flexible, and maybe even make some concessions to those parties that would otherwise maybe win some of the seats that they would normally have. And so they can influence some of those other parties in a variety of ways. It's the same reason that, say, in a presidential race in the United States, those candidates who have no shot of winning stay in their party's primary until the very last minute or as long as they can, because they want to try to shape the agenda as best they can, even if they can't actually win the candidacy. But that's a good question, Maricela. So the first dimension, and really the most important one of all, is the effective number of parties. And the effective number of parties, basically in a line, is defined in the following way: the number of viable political parties in a party system that includes parties of an unequal size. How many parties actually have a shot at winning? How many can actually get seats in Congress or win the presidency, realistically speaking? The idea here is to count the parties and then weigh the count by their relative strength. So it could be that a country has dozens and dozens of parties, like Peru, but maybe only 10 or 12 of them actually have any relative strength. It could be that our threshold for relative strength is any more than 5% of the vote in the legislature. Say we choose that to be our threshold. The idea would be count the number of parties who have more than 5% of the vote, and then weight them according to their relative share of the legislative vote. This is also sometimes referred to as party system fragmentation, because it relates to the dispersion of authority or the dispersion of representation among different parties. Party systems that are fragmented have lots and lots of parties. Party systems that are less fragmented have only a few parties. So Latin American party systems stand out because of how much the effective number of parties has changed in these places since 1970. And so there are some countries like Chile and Uruguay where there are about 2 effective parties. In Chile, there's the right-wing Alianza coalition. That was traditionally what it was called. On the left, it's the Concertación coalition. And these are coalitions of rightist and leftist parties that basically function as political parties, party coalitions. Ecuador has Uruguay has a similar situation, essentially two parties, liberals and conservatives. Now, on the other hand, there are a lot of countries that have many, many more parties. Ecuador and Peru have like 10 or 12 parties. Brazil has like 10 or 12 parties who have a realistic shot at winning seats in the Congress and or possibly winning the presidency as well. And moreover, there can even be variation between the executive and the legislature, as in Colombia, where there's a lot more there's a lot more presidential fragmentation than there is legislative fragmentation. And I'll show you that in a moment. And then it's also the case that the effective number of parties can increase over time. And so in countries like Costa Rica, for instance, Costa Rica was traditionally a two-party system until 2002, when an outsider party won a fair share of votes, and where in subsequent years, more third parties won more seats. That's an interesting example of change, and it's an example that doesn't represent the common experience in Latin America, but there are some other examples like that. Argentina, for instance, is a place that saw some similar change over the course of the 90s and the 2000s, an increase in the number of relevant parties. Colombia is also a country where, at the presidential level in particular, there was an increase in the relevant number of parties, especially in the 2000s. And so it's interesting because it varies across time and space, and it varies from chamber to chamber, and even from branch to branch. Yes, Quinn, you're correct. Typically speaking, presidential systems tend to have a lower number of effective parties. And this is, well, I think what I want to clarify is that I think what you might mean is that majoritarian systems, which are often presidential, tend to have fewer parties. And the reason is because they have winner-take-all districts where a single winner takes the whole constituency. But majoritarianism is not always used in Latin America. There's proportional representation in a lot of systems. I can't actually say with certainty whether presidentialism has a lower number of parties in most cases. I think what you might be picking up on is the fact that many parliamentary regimes in Europe have proportional representation, and they tend to have more parties. They tend to have 5 or 6 parties. But I think that what we're picking up on in Latin America is that there's just a tremendous degree of fragmentation in society. There are different interest groups. They are weakly coordinated and weakly organized and not well concentrated often. And as a result, we have a lot of different competing parties. And this is maybe especially the case in countries that have proportional representation systems. But as to the link between presidentialism and the number of parties, I think that it has more to do, frankly, with the type of electoral system, whether it's a majoritarian or a proportional representation system. So let's take a look at the example of Costa Rica. Here's a country that we haven't studied much at all in this class, but that is an important example of a Latin American country with a robust tradition of two-party rule. And until 2002, Costa Rica had a two-party system dominated by the Social Christian Unity Party and the National Liberation Party. Now, these two parties made it extremely difficult for anybody to win office with the support of any other party. And in fact, no one really could until 2002, when a new party, the Citizens Action Party, had a strong showing. And then in 2006, when more new parties gained seats. And today, Costa Rica remains a multi-party system. This is important because it signifies the capacity of the system to evolve. Many of you may have asked before, why is there only a two-party system in the US? Why can't we have more parties? And that's a good question. I would suggest that a lot of it has to do with the electoral institutions and the fact that we have winner-take-all elections where the winner of a district takes that whole constituency, as opposed to that constituency being divided up according to the proportion won by different parties. In Costa Rica, the situation obviously was more conducive to change. And since 2002, Costa Rica has had a multi-party system. But along with Colombia and Venezuela, for many, many years, Costa Rica was treated as a canonical example of a two-party Latin American democracy. And it was considered a very robust democracy. It still is, by the way. It hasn't really deteriorated, but it has become a multi-party system. You might be asking why. What is the reason for that? We'll discuss some of those causes here momentarily when we discuss the role of electoral reform and some other factors as well. Now, I want to show you the Colombian data, which is really interesting. You'll notice that, oh, by the way, what I said earlier about the president and the legislature, I had that reversed. I'm sorry. What you'll notice here is that between 1978 and about 1998, there was considerable stability in the effective number of parties for both the president, the upper house, and the lower house. And in fact, during that time, the number of parties basically oscillated between about 2 and about 3.5. But beginning in 1998, the effective number of parties for the lower house and the upper house of the legislature skyrocketed. And by 2006, the effective number of parties was about 9, where it was previously, at the very start of that process, about 2. Now, the effective number of parties for the presidency remained relatively even at about 3 during this whole period of time. And what this shows you is that in Colombia, the system did not collapse like it did in Peru and Venezuela, but it did change considerably in terms of the overall degree of fragmentation as measured by the effective number of parties. And again, this raises really interesting questions because why would this happen, right? Why would there be such a considerable fragmentation right at this moment in time in 1998? Well, I think that one possibility is that there was probably an electoral reform or some kind of a political reform that changed the incentives faced by different parties and changed the ways that votes and seats would be counted and allotted. Those are often the triggers for these kinds of changes because they redistribute power and they redistribute representation in important ways. Let's take a look at Argentina from 1983 to 2015. What you'll see is that there was a great deal of continuity between 83 and about 2001 in terms of the effective number of parties for the president and the effective number of parties for the lower house of the Congress. But beginning in 2003, and really in that year especially, there was an increase, a substantial increase in the effective number of parties competing for the presidency. And then 2 years later, or about many years later actually, that would be 8 years later, there was a significant increase in the effective number of parties running for the lower house. And this is the story of Argentina in large part during the 2000s because of the collapse of traditional parties that were badly affected by the government's handling of the economic crisis in the 80s and the 90s and the loss of confidence in those parties that a lot of voters had. Much like the experience in Peru and in Venezuela, in Argentina, voters turned their backs on a lot of those traditional parties. And though today parties like the Peronists have returned to form and are quite powerful again, there was a period where those traditional parties had really fallen from grace in the eyes of voters. And so yet again, we're seeing a lot of change over time, and we're seeing the evolution of these systems. We're seeing a lot of change of the sort that we don't really experience in a system like the United States. Sarah says, America's two-party system is also a result of the founding fathers not intending for the people to vote. Originally, they expected America to have multiple systems that would never win majority, so ultimately the president would be selected by the House. I'm not sure if these same constructs apply to many Latin American countries. Do they have a threshold as well for how many people need to vote for a president to win? Or is it just a majority vote, even if the nation is divided by multiple groups? No, it's just a plurality. It's not even a majority. You know, say you have two candidates, but neither wins a full majority because, you know, a small fraction of people write in, you know, Donald Duck or something as like a third candidate or whatever. the candidate who wins the plurality of the vote, simply the largest share among the candidates on the ballot, wins. So there's not really a threshold in that regard. It really is just who wins the race. And so Argentina, like Colombia, is an example of change without collapse, whereas countries like Peru and Venezuela, as you know from earlier in the course, did experience collapse. Now, I've talked about Brazil and how fragmented Brazil is in the Congress and in the party system. And a good example of this is from 2018. This is a depiction of the results, the parliamentary representation in the Brazilian parliament at that time. And each color that you see represents a different political party. And I think total here, there's like 8 or 9 or 10 different parties at the very least. And Brazil is considered an extreme case of party system fragmentation because of just how dispersed political authority truly is in the legislature in Brazil. This makes it really, really difficult for a government from a single party, like the Workers' Party under Dilma Rousseff, for example, to mobilize legislative support, because you've got to stitch together a coalition of many, many different parties just to get across the finish line and put together a winning majority. But that doesn't mean that they don't do so effectively. They do. And in fact, Brazil is one example of a country that has overcome the limits of presidentialism in this regard. They do stitch together those coalitions, and Brazilian presidents have one of the highest degrees of presidential success and presidential legislative success of any Latin American country. So this fragmentation does not mean that presidents cannot accomplish things. Now, we have only a minute left, and we're not done with this lecture, but this will be the last slide for today. And so hang with me while I finish this half of the lecture that we'll finish on Monday of next week. But what I want to tell you before we leave is that party system fragmentation is very fluid. It responds often to changes in the social and the political and the economic environment. And what that means is that if those traditional parties become discredited in the eyes of voters, either because of their failure to handle a crisis or their inability to govern or respond or legislate meaningfully, they will oftentimes be replaced by outsider parties who will win a larger share of the vote at the next election. And so one example of a crisis that is serving to discredit some of these traditional parties is COVID-19. We've talked about this already. COVID-19 is really contributing to further political fragmentation in Latin America. It's doing this because citizens are protesting the handling of the crisis, and they're dissatisfied with the handling of the crisis. And in particular, they feel left out because of the failures of reforms of the previous decade. These reforms would have set these governments up to handle the crises more effectively. But as a result of those failed reforms, as a result of the consequences of COVID-19, people are beginning to shift their loyalty to new parties. They're beginning to support new parties. So in a country like Chile, for example, parties of Frente Amplio, the Broad Front, an emerging leftist coalition that is trying to peel away seats and votes from the Concertación center-left coalition, those parties are increasingly rising up and getting more and more support. And they're expected to get more seats at the next election, which I think takes place in a year or two. But the point is that these moments of crisis can serve to deepen political fragmentation, even in those cases where it seemed least likely. And the reason is because voters become dissatisfied with the handling of the crisis, and they become more willing to shift their loyalty and vote for other parties at the next election. And so keep your eyes peeled, because as new elections start to take place in Latin American countries, you should expect to find that there are going to be new political parties that get representation. You should find that there are new moments of crisis that might arise when new parties come into conflict with old parties. And in general, you should expect to find that fragmentation increases and the effective number of parties increases. Now, if I'm wrong, come back to me and say I was wrong. But then you'll have an interesting question. Why was it that traditional parties were able to withstand the consequences of COVID-19? And why is it that party fragmentation was not affected by COVID-19? But this is where we are in Latin America. The possibility of a new day, new political fragmentation as a consequence of the coronavirus. Now, we will continue with this on Monday. Oh, Quinn is asking, where can we read this article? This article can be read at America's Quarterly. Quinn and others, I'll go ahead and try to post this under announcements, and you can also use the link that I provide to read the articles that are provided by this publication, because it's a really good one. But you can read it at America's Quarterly. Okay, everybody, so that does wrap up the lecture for today. We'll finish on Monday. But thank you again, everyone, for being here and working so hard in this class. I'm very happy to be with you in discussing this. I hope that you learned something from this and that you're ready to re-engage on Monday. But I'll stop the recording now, and you can hang around and ask questions if you want. But otherwise, I'll see you on Monday.